Lecture 14. This tape has a few gaps where the microphone became detached from the machine. Revealed knowledge. St. Thomas says this on page 192, Article 12. Besides the knowledge we have of God by natural reason, is there in this life a deeper knowledge that we have through grace? And we said earlier that all knowledge that we have of God is analogical, in the sense that no concept reproduces or represents him adequately. So we're always talking then about affirming certain things at the same time as denying certain perfections of God. We said this analogy is able to be applied on the natural plane and on the supernatural plane. Almost no one talks about the second, which is one of these things in theology which doesn't get much play. I think one of the reasons is that nobody knows too much about it. But the natural people, for example, talk with reference to analogical terms in metaphysics and natural theology. But there's also a supernatural analogical process. And one of the best persons that done anything is on the person that was my mentor at Freiburg, Nicola, who wrote a book, God Known as Unknown. It's not translated. God Known as Unknown. But he goes through the three kinds of knowledges there. First of all, the natural theology or metaphysics. And then he looks at the knowledge of faith and finally mystical experience in that book. It's a long book. It was put out by the, I think, French Academy of Philosophy. And he does explore this thing in probably more depth than anyone I know in the world. I remember Father Mahoney, who I think is teaching at Providence College now, who came to Freiburg for a doctorate in philosophy. He said that Nicola's book was something which was rather revolutionary on the scene insofar as it even natural theologians don't, or theologians of natural theology don't have much, hasn't done much in this area. But anyway, other theologians have at least referred to it. I was giving you three different positions or three different words, and they're found in my dissertation. You can look at the authors. Journet was one, and I'll try to explain what I mean in a moment. Cardinal Journet wrote voluminously, but anyway, he talks about this analogy of faith, or the supernatural analogy is called the trans-analogy. And Nicola just says it's the analogy of faith. He leaves it at that. And Jacques Maritain speaks about it as the super-analogy. The term he uses in the French is sur-analogie. So it's above the regular kind of analogy. I'll give an example that might illustrate this, and we'll see this when we do question 13, which deals with the univocal, the equivocal, and the analogical use of words. And as I say, I think we'll see this more clearly then. But in any case, an example would be, well, let's start with the natural plane first. We've used the term being, as you know, for God and for the creature. We said the term could be extended, then denied, and then we said that God is ultra being, or use it in an eminent or a more excellent way. So we said there are three steps the mind goes through: the causality step, then the negation step, and finally the third one where we say the term is there but in a more eminent or excellent fashion. This is relatively easy here because we can take an example like being and realize that the term itself doesn't lend itself to any kind of imperfection. We sometimes call these perfect words, or sometimes called unmixed perfections, in the sense that we can extend being, we can extend truth, we can extend goodness of a reality at whatever level we find them. They lend themselves. But what do you do with a reality such as Father? Now we're in a situation that doesn't lend itself to an analogical sense. Does anyone know why? Yeah.
Are you not equivocating because there's different respects which is used?
In different respects, for example?
Yeah.
What's the primary respect?
Between father and son and a human relationship during procreation.
All right, which is physical, isn't it?
Yes.
All right. So then you look at the term father, and we realize that he procreates physically. How can you say that of God? Huh? Got a real problem, don't you? Or Son of God. Or Holy Spirit of God. So you notice then, these words, or even if you want to take the term person, we use so commonly of the three persons in God. So we ask ourselves, how can that reality, person, which normally means for us what? The singular being, made up of matter and form, isn't it? So that's our person. And all of a sudden now we're saying there are three persons in God. Huh? So you notice then, what they're trying to say is that these words normally, on the natural plane, would not lend themselves to that kind of analogical use or of extension, of moving from the area of causality, negation, and then affirmation in a more excellent way. How that impasse is broken is by revelation. So revelation tells us then that certain realities or certain words then can apply to the creature and to God. Notice they call these then serenalogy, the analogy of faith, or the analogy that rises above then the so-called natural analogical words. So we can say then that Father can be said of God in some perfect sense, not with the physical limitations, not with the limitations then of procreation, but some kind of eternal generation in a spiritual way of a mental word, the Son. And between them then there is a relationship of love, again, not a physical kind of a carnal love, but rather a person, the Holy Spirit. So these words then and realities lend themselves to an extension then and an affirmation over and above, as I say, anything in the natural plane. That's why they use this, these terms by calling them, these are analogical words of faith, or the trans-analogical words of faith, or the super-analogical words of faith, because they realize no way on the natural plane would these words or realities lend themselves to that. And as I say, you're not going to see much discussion anywhere in this, in any book, because people aren't usually that profound. When they talk about analogical terms, they just use the term broadly and just sweep across, as if all words then are the same. So as I say, probably you're not going to see much of this, and I wouldn't expect that you know this, although I will refer to these little goodies just so that you're able to, you said that you saw them once, but as far as the details, I don't think that. Steve, you had a question. Unmixed in the sense that these words allow themselves to be extended, whereas rock, or anger, or passion do not allow themselves to be extended of God unless I see some proper perfection behind these things. Rock meaning power, power referring to all being. So I can look at some term behind these things, but then I have to purify, or I have to take away, or extract, or abstract from the impure or the contaminated reality. Because God can be called a rock, or God can be said to be angry. But you notice I have to purify those words of the, in other words, there's a perfection that's hidden in those things, but I have to purify them when I attribute them to God. These are sometimes called metaphorical words. And they're called mixed or imperfect ways of predicating God.
Would any of these three authors suggest that these words like Father, Son, and Person show a common subjective understanding?
A subjective understanding.
A common subjective understanding of something supernatural. In other words, I'm thinking of the word person.
Right.
Within 10 years, the word person has undergone a tremendous change.
Unless you define it.
Pardon?
Unless you define it.
Yes.
If you define it, then of course the definition lends itself to that reality always. Then you can redefine it if you want. But as long as you're consonant on it, then you're safe. That's why the early councils had to define the words with reference to Jesus, the mystery of Jesus. Homoousios, for example, became a touchstone. And ousios was spelled out, both in the Greek and the Latin. So people knew exactly this meant substance. Because even that word was had a problem apparently by the Bishop of Alexandria, Dionysius, who had the same name as the Pope Dionysius in 261. And he wrote back and says, I think this is right. And the Bishop of Rome said, no, you correct yourself. There's an instance very early of the Pope intervening in history, saying, get your act together, Bishop, because you're not in conformity with us. So you can see again, there was a case in which he was using the term wrongly, apostasis, which of course is substance. So as long as you define your words, then you're okay. And that's why Vatican I, for the Roman Catholic Church in Canon 3 there, says that dogmas which has been defined must have that same sense always, or let the person be anathema. That's a de fide statement there in Vatican I, so it's not something people should just play with. Those dogmas or propositions of faith that were defined by previous councils are forever, because they refer to realities and not just subjective states of the mind. All right, any more questions? Well, let's go back to that article for a moment. Thomas merely says that the intelligible light has to be improved, and he refers that to grace. But he also says that you're given more images, which are better suited to God. And he says you get that from God's revelation. And this is what he's referring to. You get better images or better ways by which to express God's life. Let's look at the replies for a moment. I think they illuminate above. Number 1 says, although in this life revelation does not tell us what God is, and thus joins us to him as to an unknown, nevertheless it helps us to know him better in that we are shown more and greater works of his, like charity, life everlasting, beatific vision, which natural reason would not show, and are taught in certain things about him that we could never have known through natural reason, as for instance that he is both three in one, the Trinity. Then the second one, the stronger intellectual light, the deeper understanding we derive from images, whether these be received in a natural way from the senses or formed in imagination by divine power. Revelation provides us with a divine life which enables us to attain a more profound understanding from these images. So again, you need both the power and the object. The object in this case, of course, is a revealed object or revealed knowledge. Then the third one, faith is a sort of knowledge in that it makes the mind assent to something. For example, that Jesus is divine. The assent is not due to what is seen by the believer, seen in the sense of having evidence, but to what is seen by him who is believed. So God knows that his son Jesus is God. In that it lacks the element of seeing, faith fails to be a genuine knowledge, which wants evidence. For such knowledge causes the mind to assent through what is seen and through understanding of first principles. So the human person then in this life is never going to have evidence for the realities of faith, but in spite of that he can still have certitude. Certitude in the sense that he relies or depends for that knowledge on God. And therefore his intellect is not standing in some quivering fashion, but is actually firming very strongly and steadfastly with constancy that this is true because God said it, even though he doesn't see it or have evidence for those things. All right, any questions in question 12? I'm in question 13, and I'm going to have you skip over several things here. What I think I'll start off with theological language here is with something we looked at earlier, but at least I'll put it in some kind of order here now. And that's these univocal, analogical, and equivocal words which some of you have seen for the nth time, but in any case, some of you haven't. You recall that we're in the area of logic, and we're trying to put some order into our knowledge and into the order of reality. So the mind tries to order those realities in some kind of hierarchy. And it says that some things have, on observation, the same nature, or at least very general things that can be said to be, they can be said to be share in common or be in common. So a univocal word then is a word or name which is said of two or more things which have the same nature and therefore defined in the same fashion. The human person is rational, so is a human person is an animal, so is a lion. Both share animalness, both have sensible natures. So therefore one can use the same definition then of both the human person and the lion in that case, as far as I stick at the genus level. One can say this also of various kinds of virtues, which, as you know, are good habits perfecting the spirit part of the human person, whether the mind or the will. Courage and temperance are examples, moral virtues in this case. Or one can say that various sports, as games of some sort, can be divided into football and basketball and baseball and other things. The important thing is that they have the same nature and they have the same definition. And once they have those, then of course they can be put together in some kind of order or classification or category. Now, to make the opposite or the condivided situation very clear, just put a negative in there. So if you don't have it this way, then you have it the other way. Or let's put it a contradiction to start with. Equivocal words then are going to be those that don't have the same definition. So one does, one doesn't. Many theologians have said in the past that because the human person has a definition different from God, that all words then are equivocal. So people began to make a distinction then, saying, well, that's right in a certain sense, but on the other hand, there is a relationship between the human person and God, or from the effect to the cause, and therefore we should say there is some similarity. So for that reason, they gave a distinction in the equivocal into two kinds. I prefer this division, by the way. Some prefer just three kinds, univocal, equivocal, and analogical. This one I think is clearer because it shows a negative immediately with reference to the definition. So the purely equivocal then means that words just happen. Wouldn't get the bat, however. Tennis racket. Talk to one that's had experience. Not chase bats. An analogical word then is one then that is going to have a definition different again from the other word, but there's going to be a similarity between the two terms, something that I have imposed on the terms, sometimes called like contrived, deliberate. My mind comes into play when I talk about health foods. Person is healthy. His complexion is healthy. But as I say, I think we bear that this belongs to a general category of equivocal, then you notice you're never going to apply the same definition. Whereas otherwise, if you say there are three kinds, people tend then to waffle. This prevents waffling. You either are or aren't. So if we apply the word health primarily, say, to the human person or to an animal, then we extend the words to secondary things which have a similarity. They cause health or signs of health. Or another word would be being. We apply it primarily to substance, secondarily to accident. sometimes in a language it's difficult to see which came first. But that's, we can look at it historically, but that doesn't away from the analysis here. Now I think you can see that when Thomas goes through these articles in question 13, he is saying, even though the definition that we have of a creaturely perfection is different from the perfection in God, or the definition of that, if we could have a definition, there's not a purely equivocal relationship. It's not just a question of sounding or looking like, but rather there is a relationship. There is a similarity between the cause and effect, even though the cause is transcendent. That's why he'll reduce these perfection words then to the analogical category, insofar as they do have a relationship of cause and effect. So let's look at any questions just on this distinction here, first of all? Analogical, yeah.
You put analogical under
Exactly. If you keep the definitions in mind, that's the best way to handle that, then you'll see why. In the univocal situation, the definition of the word or the reality that I'm talking about is always the same. Animal is the same of the human person and a horse, all right? Now, if I use the equivocal, the definition is always different. So I got a perfect similarity, perfect difference then. One is not, all right? Then you notice under here, I can say purely equivocal. Of course, the definition is completely different. Here, the definition is still different, because I don't use the definition of health for food in the same way as for a human person.
So you're emphasizing the fact that there is an equivocation.
Exactly. For emphasizing the fact the difference, aren't I? Because then, as I say, you have a perfect division. Your mind is much easier if you have perfect divisions to remember than trying to float around with these. So it's easy then for, say, a person to say is not.
In the analogical sense, that would also be called equivocation by design.
Sure. Equivocation by design, or I contrive, or I impose. Yeah, exactly. All right, question 13. I know some of you in the higher courses in logic, and I think that's where they do it, maybe even Phil science, but I think logic is where you do this anyway. Article number 1 on page 195. Can we use any words to refer to God? Thomas is going to say, yes, we can. So let's look on 196, see what Thomas says there. A principle that he's going to use throughout these articles is one he starts very early with. He says, Aristotle says that words are signs for thoughts, and thoughts are likenesses of things. So words refer to things indirectly through thoughts. So you have a reality out here, tree, you have your concept, then you have your word. So he's saying you start with real things, you have an idea of those, and then you name those. And so he's going to say, can you then name anything of God? So let's see how he moves on then. How we refer to a thing depends on how we understand it. All right? So we have to, as we say, how a thing is going to impinge upon us, then is going to be the way in which we're going to start referring to things. We have already seen that in this life we do not see the essence of God. We only know him from creatures, effects. We think of him as their source, and then as surpassing them all and as lacking not anything that is merely creaturely. It is the knowledge we have of creatures that enables us to use words to refer to God. And so these words do not express divine essence as it is in itself. In this they differ from a word like man, which is intended to express by its meaning the essence of man. So notice then, all our knowledge, whether we like it or not, starts with sense realities. We can say with material realities. So since that is our starting point, and our only starting point according to Aristotle and St. Thomas, this means that any word that we use is going to have to start first of all here, and then even though we try to purify it and extend it and find the affirmative God, as we mentioned the other day, it's always going to have its starting point here. You notice how limited then we are with reference to our knowledge of God, because we're starting with these very sense realities. The only way we can break that impasse is by, if we could have angelic knowledge, would give us a greater realization of God, but even there, you're still dealing with concepts. Even angel beings then are knowing God naturally in the sense of from their natures, by means of ideas. So the only way we can break that impasse is by the beatific vision, or seeing the essence of God. At that point, we'll know the definition of God. Until that point, we are not knowing in any way the whatness, the quiddity, or the definition of God. We're merely using words then. We don't want to deny the impact of the words, because they do signify. The mystics are going to have the same problem with reference to God, because they're not going to be able to use words either to try to express their transcendent experience. It's a grace experience, and all of them will start with, I wish I could say it better, but that's the only way I can say it. If you've gone through some of these things, John the Cross and Teresa will say, then you have a better appreciation of it because you can identify with these things. But if you haven't, well, then you just have to accept my word for it. So that's about it. So, all right, you can skip all the replies in that article. Why don't I just bang through these, and then if there are any questions after them, because I think they're all related. Article number 2. Do any of the words we use of God express something of what he is? The answer is yes. The something here is some perfection, something of his whatness, if you can. And then he excludes negative words and relational words. Negative word doesn't say much. He is non-good. I'll give you an example at this. Say that you were describing a person that you're in love with, all right? And we'll assume, for the sake of the example, the John-Mary syndrome, all right? So John is saying things of Mary at this time, and John is talking to Jim. And Jim says, what's she like? Well, she's not this. And he says, well, what is she like? She's not this. And then he says something else. She's not that. You get to, oh gosh, what is she like? You're not getting very far. Right? So negative words don't say an awful lot, huh? So Thomas is saying you can exclude that. Or say that you look at the other kind of term he looks at here, causes and effect. And you will say, well, what about Mary here? Well, she built a house. She's a house builder. Well, that's nice. And she likes to sew. Thank goodness, huh? All right? So the consequence, she is now, say, a cause of sewing. So you're getting to all these different points here about cause, but you're not saying an awful lot about her intrinsic makeup, because you're talking about all these effects that she does. Well, what's Mary like? Let's get down to the bottom line. Huh? So Thomas then gets down to the bottom line of the next page. You can skip all the way at the bottom of the last 3 lines on 199, all the way over the next page to the last paragraph on that page. So in other words, looking at about 10 lines from the bottom on page 200. He talks about the idea of relations and about God as a cause, and shows that these don't really get to the essence of God at all in any way. Now, he's not saying we exhaust God's essence. That's not his point. But he wants to say, can we say anything in a positive way about God's essence? So a solution is on the bottom of 200. So we must find some other solution to the problem. We shall suggest that such words do say what God is. They are predicated of him in the category of substance. Notice, not accident. Huh? He is something which stands in its own right. But they fail to represent adequately what he is. The reason for this is that we speak of God as we know him. Notice again, we start with our creatures, and we're limited always by the knowledge we have of creatures. And since we know him from creatures, we can only speak of him as they represent him, which is always very inferior. Huh? Any creature, insofar as it possesses any perfection, represents God as like to him, being goodness, truth. For he, like being simply and universally perfect, has replies again of that article. The third one, article number 3, can we say something literally about God? Why don't you put 2 words in there, properly and formally? Because the words that are usually used in theological manuals or theological books are the words proper and formal. And Thomas says, yes, we can. And he's going to go back to these perfection words like goodness and being, those things that don't have any kind of imperfection in the word itself. On page 203, he says this in his reply. If you go down about 6 lines on that page, he says, firstly, the perfections themselves that are signified, goodness, life, and the like. And secondly, the way in which they are signified. So far as the perfections signified are concerned, the words are used literally of God, or formally, and in fact more appropriately than the use of creatures. For these perfections belong primarily to God and only secondarily to others. Notice what he's saying is that when I speak of being or goodness, they really belong first to God, and secondarily then to the creature. Notice, being belongs to God and secondarily, even though the way I come to being, in my experience, is first of the creature. But it primarily belongs to God who is all being. Or my notion of goodness, again, comes through my awareness of things that are desirable. But again, I have to say that that perfection exists primarily and substantially in God, where it's identified with his being. But then he says that the way we signify these words is always inadequate. That goes back to what we mentioned before, this idea of denying and making more excellent. So the way we conceive these words or signify, we keep denying that they have the same signification in the creature and of God. There's another way that he's looking at these words, in essence, or the reply to the first one, and he uses the term metaphorical. And he says there is a way in which we can look at those words as having something, as I said before, behind them which signifies. If you go down about 3 lines down, he says, thus it is part of the meaning of rock that it has its being in a merely material way. Such words can be used of God only metaphorically. There are other words, however, that simply mean certain perfections, without any indication of how these perfections are possessed, like being, goodness, and things. So the word metaphorical can be used of God, provided, as I say, if I extract or abstract from the imperfection. They're called mixed words or mixed perfections, because there is a reality that's genuine in those. Like behind the word rock, I mean something that's powerful, which goes with pure act. So there is something, as I say, behind it, but I have to, as I say, purify it from its sensible or body meaning. Article number 4, all the words predicated of God synonymous. Thomas says, no, they are not. And he goes back to the principle he articulated at the very beginning. He said, words signify ideas. Ideas signify realities. So he says, when I use the word justice, I have in mind a given idea, and that idea is not the same as mercy, or goodness is not the same as truth. So notice he says these words then are not synonymous. They actually refer then to different thoughts. And he says this is the way that we use words to represent, to signify concepts, which in turn, as I say, signify real things. Let's give an example that might illustrate this, then we'll refer to God. This is a prism, all right? And we're looking at this prism now, and we're seeing that it is one reality, or one real thing. However, if I just glance at it in a certain way, I see it's yellow. Then all of a sudden, I see it's purple or violet. And I say, gosh, it's different. It's yellow. No. And then it's purple. No, it's red. Then I say, is yellow the same as red? And I say, no, it is not the same thing. But you notice the words I'm using refer to concepts which refer to the same thing, which I say they're all identified in this reality, all those perfections. Now I realize the light is making a certain casting, making those different colors come to the fore. But the principle it's analogous, but it's a principle that can be used with reference to God. So I look at the various words, goodness, and I say that represents a certain concept I have in the creaturely world, and I say God has that. I look at mercy and I say that has a certain meaning in a creaturely world. Someone who is benevolent, who looks upon a person with kindness, who forgives all faults because of his goodness and his compassion towards people. He looks at with pity then upon us who are creaturely and sinful creatures. So as I say, we look at that concept, we say that's different from justice, which wants to mete out some punishment for deeds. So they do symbolize, as I say, concepts which in turn, as I say, symbolize real things. And if you go over on page 205, let's just summarize this. The last sentence before the replies. He said, this is about 4 lines up from the replies on page 205. He said, thus the words we use for the perfection we attribute to God, although they signify what is one, like the prism, God is one, are not synonymous, for they signify it from many different points of view. And then the same thing is a reply to the first objection. He says, the solution of the first objection is then clear. Synonyms signify the same thing from the same point of view. Words that signify the same thing thought of in different ways do not, properly speaking, signify the same, for words only signify things by means of thoughts as noted above. All right, article number 5 are words used univocally or equivocally of God and creatures. Flip over to page 207. Got lots of objections here. And the problem is, of course, different people thought that one could say more of God or less of God because of starting with the creatures. On 207, he first of all, the very beginning, says one does not say things univocally of God and the creature. He says it is impossible to predicate anything univocally of God and the creatures because everything is inadequate. If you flip to the bottom of the page now, 207, the last 4 lines, you might put there not purely equivocal. At the top of the page you might put not univocal or just univocal expressions. So at the bottom of the page he says, yet although we never use words in exactly the same sense of creatures and God, we are not merely equivocating when we use the same word, as some have said, for if this were so, we could never argue from statements about creatures to statements about God, like being even. And he says you'd fall into the area of the fallacy of equivocation. Then it's about 6 lines on page 208. You can put number 3 there. You're talking about analogical words. He said, we must therefore say that words are used of God and creatures in an analogical way, that is, in accordance with a certain order between them. Then he talks about the 2 kinds of analogy. One says things, as I mentioned the other day, there's a definite, determinate proportion between 2 things. 2 is to 4 is, 3 is to 6. So there's a definite proportion between those things. The other is indefinite. Or there's a relationship, for example, of substance and accident, being to being, not with this kind of direct, definite way. No accident will ever take the kind of perfection that being or that a substance has. So he says you have to talk about, as I say, those being of 2 different kinds. You can skip all the replies to that article as well. The main point, I think you can see that you have to get these terms down, analogical, equivocal. Then it's a question of just plugging them into these different problems. And once you do that, then you see that these words are not synonymous because they refer to thoughts which do not refer to the same reality. Although the reality may be one, say in the case of God, at least the thought or the image I have of him is different. Any questions on any one of those articles or the problem of naming God or calling God by different words?
Would you be able to give another example of words signifying concepts?
Words signify concepts, being an example like that? Tree, treeness, tree, human person in mind, John, Mary, Sue, whatever it might be, and lion, for lioness, for lion. Word is an arbitrary sign of a concept which I have in my mind or an idea of my mind which represents real things. So whether I go to France and look at a tree there, the concept is the same, even though they might use a different word for tree.
The concept is always universal.
Always universal. All human knowledge on the intellectual plane is universal. Sense knowledge is particular.
So we're talking about a word that
See, as soon as we start using words, automatically we're universalizing, aren't we? Even verbs. And when you talk about is running, person is running, you can say, he is one who runs. So you can set up a proposition even there. One who runs is a concept. It could be a big category of people who are running, like the marathons. All right, I would like to move into the area of theology now. How does that sound? Since we've been bogged. All right, I would like to pose the problem that's going to confront us for the next half of the course before we get to looking at the mystics. And the problem is this. If we look at the history of Christianity, and we could actually look beyond that, but usually Christianity is the one that's given the explicitation to this. We see a problem. First of all, we see people in Christianity, witnesses, that claim, maintain, that they've had some experience of God. God has touched them in some way, profoundly, intimately. They are moved by that experience. Some people say God, or they met God, or they had a direct experience of God, immediate experience. You could see they're groping, they're grappling with words, trying to delineate, explain, define what this very meaningful experience or conversion or relationship entails. We already know, and that was the reason for going through this first part, that if we speak about this as the beatific vision, we're going to have problems. But you see, they don't have that theological background. So sometimes they'll say, God directly manifested himself to me. Or I directly, immediately had an experience of God. And as I say, they don't understand all the implications of that, but they want to get across the point that this was something, as I say, dramatic, and something profound in their lives. The Christian will say that in this life, the knowledge that we have, going back to Revelation and St. Paul, the knowledge we have in this life is enigmatic, obscure, not evident. St. Paul says we know in a mirror, in a dark fashion, obscure fashion, not face to face. Jesus praises people for believing even though they don't see. And even chastises Thomas, the apostle. You should have done better, Thomas. Or poor Philip. After walking with Jesus for the years he did and seeing all the things, Philip says, when are you going to show us the Father? What are you about, Jesus? And Jesus kind of throws up his arms and he says, don't you understand, Philip? You saw me, huh? And seeing me, you see the Father, huh? But you see, Philip, again, at that time, the resurrection and the Pentecostal experience hadn't really transpired, so he didn't have kind of strong faith that they got at the time of Pentecost. In fact, many biblical commentators will say that the Feast of Pentecost could actually be considered as some kind of mystical experience for the apostles. Some will even use the word second conversion for the apostles to try to illustrate the first conversion when they first walked with Jesus, first turned their paths on his path, but they also had to undergo a second burn or second kind of conversion. And we'll see when we look at John of the Cross, the dark night of the senses. Many mystical theologians will speak about that as a second conversion for people, where they really turn their hearts and their faces towards God. St. Teresa of Avila, and I think that she was probably beyond this at this time, but anyway, at the age of 39, she came to the realization, she says, my former life has been lived in a lukewarm fashion. I finally began to take this stuff seriously. And she says, I had a great, great transformation in my life. And she says, I began to experience mystical things from that age on, or that time on. So even she's so direct and so forward and honest in her theology that you can see that she's trying to say that she kind of limped around for a while. And even though she had entered the convent earlier, 20 years earlier, or 15 years earlier, she didn't realize the full impact of that. This completes side 2 of lecture number 14.